And now the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. Ideas rarely stand alone. They travel in lineage, shaped by older rhythms of thought. This essay traces one of those ideas, Mel Robbins' deceptively simple phrase, "let them," back through its philosophical roots, not to suggest derivation, but to offer depth. What appears on the surface as a practical self-help mantra quietly echoes centuries of ethical reflection, relational wisdom, and emotional discipline. This is not a critique. It is a tracing, a way of showing that clarity is rarely solitary and that modern insight often arrives carrying the weight of older voices. Behind Robbins' phrase are the structures of Epictetus' calm refusal, Frankl's defiant space of choice, Carl Rogers' unconditional regard, Iris Murdoch's moral attention, Judith Butler's relational agency, and Thich Nhat Hanh's spacious love. This essay follows those threads, not to overwrite what Robbins has given, but to unfold it, to reveal the deeper structure that gives the phrase its lasting resonance. Because let them is more than a coping mechanism. It is a posture, a quiet philosophy of freedom and relation. And when paired with its second movement, let me, it becomes a kind of ethic, one that reclaims dignity not through dominance, but through discernment. This is an essay about that ethic, its lineage, and the tender, often invisible work of living it. It begins in the quiet moments, when someone ignores your message, when a loved one chooses differently than you'd hoped, when you catch yourself rehearsing a reply to a conversation that hasn't even happened. There's a tightening, a friction between what is and what you wish would be. And in that gap, something ancient stirs, the impulse to fix, to intervene, to hold the world in place through force of care. It can feel like loyalty, like love, even like responsibility. But often it is a subtle violation of another's freedom and a slow erosion of your own. Let them, Mel Robbins says. And at first it sounds dismissive, but it is not. It is the first step in reclaiming the space that Viktor Frankl described, the space between stimulus and response, between what they do and how you react. There is a moment, and in that moment there is a choice. Let them is how you step into that space. You do not stop feeling, you stop managing. You stop performing presence in someone else's story and begin returning to your own. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It is warmth without grip, a refusal to carry what isn't yours. When your partner forgets, when your friend withdraws, when your child stumbles in a way you warned against, let them does not abandon them. It respects them. It is a form of relational discipline, not to change them, but to protect the clarity from which you might one day meet again. Then comes the second movement, let me. Let me return to what is mine. Let me choose how I respond, how I carry this. Let me stop performing love as vigilance and remember that love can also look like trust, or silence, or waiting without resentment. These aren't strategies. They're forms of self-stewardship. They ask, what kind of person do I become when I stop being everyone else's regulator? A mother once stood by her teenage son at prom, adjusting his collar, pushing the boutonniere too close to his chest, caught between care and choreography. Her daughter pulled her aside. "Stop," she whispered. Let them run in the rain, let them ruin their shoes, let them be." And in that moment, the mother saw it, that her effort was no longer love, it had become interruption. That scene is what Robbins carries into language, a scene of release, still tender, still watching. This is where the wisdom of centuries gathers. In the stoic calm of Epictetus, the gentle flow of Laozi, the open hand of Carl Rogers, the attention of Iris Murdoch, the interior defiance of Frankl. Their ideas are here not as citation but as resonance, as the slow lineage beneath a modern phrase. Because when you stop trying to be heard by everyone else, you begin to hear yourself again. And from that place, not reaction, but recognition, something quiet and strong returns. There is a difference between letting someone go and letting someone be. The former implies absence. The latter invites presence without interference. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. When we say let them, we are not turning away. We are stepping aside. We are acknowledging what Epictetus taught, that some things are not up to us, and among those things are the thoughts, actions, and inner lives of other people. To grasp this is not apathy. It is the first act of philosophical respect. It is also resistance to a modern impulse, to curate, to optimize, to intervene in real time. We are constantly told that love is proven through effort, through endless availability. But what if it's also proven through restraint? Through the courage to watch someone make their own choice, even when that choice worries you. Let them is the moment you honor their timeline. Let me is the moment you return to your own. It is the recognition that not all pain is harm, that the discomfort of watching someone struggle is not a signal to act, but an invitation to stay rooted while they find their footing. Carl Rogers knew this. He spoke of the unconditional positive regard required for any true growth to occur. He understood that change is not imposed, it is allowed. When we stop trying to convince, when we stop trying to rescue, a different climate emerges, one in which the other can hear themselves again, and so can we. Because the truth is, much of what we call care is often anxiety in disguise. And the trouble with anxiety is that it doesn't just bind the self, it binds the other. Let them unbinds, it creates space. And in that space, Frankl's idea returns, the space between stimulus and response, the space of freedom. Robbins doesn't use those words, but she builds the bridge nonetheless. Her gesture is pragmatic, grounded, ordinary, but its roots sink deep. In saying, let me, we reclaim the only three powers we ever truly had, to think, to act, and to feel in accordance with what is true, not what is reactive. In that alignment, dignity is restored, not only to us, but to everyone we once tried to change in order to feel safe. Letting someone be is not a loss of love, it is the beginning of a different kind. A love that does not perform, a love that does not crowd, a love that quietly, without need of proof, begins to trust. If let them is the release, let me is the re-entry. The first unhooks us from other people's behaviour, the second anchors us in our own. Together, they form a kind of hinge, a rotation from outward obsession to inward alignment. In a world trained to respond instantly, emotionally, and often performatively, this shift feels radical, but it is not new. It has always existed beneath the surface of good practice, deep thought, and real love. To say, let me, is not just to soothe the ego, it is to encounter the architecture of self-responsibility, not the brittle hyper-individualist kind, but the kind that begins in breath. Let me decide how I want to hold this moment. Let me notice what parts of this reaction are mine to carry. Let me pause before I reply, withdraw, escalate, rescue. These aren't strategies, they're forms of self-stewardship. They ask, what kind of person do I become when I stop being everyone else's regulator? Kierkegaard spoke of the self not as a given, but as a task to become what one is. And Judith Butler reminded us that we are always in relation, but never fully defined by it. Let me lives in this paradox. I am not untouched by the world, but I am not reducible to it either. My identity is not something you confirm by your behaviour. It is something I confirm through the way I respond to yours. This doesn't mean neutrality, it doesn't mean avoidance. It means choosing to act from alignment rather than anxiety. Robbins never overstates this. She doesn't frame it as revelation. She offers it as repetition, a practice, a phrase, a way to recover the moment between reaction and decision. That moment becomes sacred, not because it is dramatic, but because it is yours. And the strange thing is, the more you stay with yourself, the more space opens for others. Not space to behave however they please without consequence, but space to be human, to unfold, to change on their own terms. When you stop trying to be someone else's conscience, you create the conditions in which conscience might actually speak. That is influence without manipulation. That is leadership without control. That is presence without demand. And it begins always with the choice to stay where you are, not where they left you, where you still belong. Stephen Covey understood what most people forget, that freedom is not the absence of responsibility, but the deliberate placement of it. In The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he distilled an ancient truth into clear, accessible language. Between what happens and how we respond lies a space. And in that space, he said, is power, growth, freedom. Robbins' Let Them, Let Me theory quietly inherits this architecture. It is Covey's gap, not explained but lived. Not taught in the abstract but activated in the relational. Most of us miss that space. We collapse stimulus and response into a single gesture, reactivity. Someone says something dismissive and the reply is instant. A message is read but not returned, and resentment flares without pause. The space disappears. But Robbins offers a phrase that holds the door open. Let them. 2 syllables that slow time just enough for the mind to re-enter itself. Just enough to keep the self from being pulled into the velocity of someone else's mistake. And then comes the second gift. Let me. Covey's power of choice, rendered not as a slogan but as a practice. Let me decide not just what to say, but whether to say anything. Let me choose to feel this feeling without handing it off to someone else in the form of blame. Let me ask what matters here, not as performance, but as a way of living inside myself with less noise. This is agency, not as control over others, but as intimacy with your own responses. When Robbins' phrase went viral, it was not because people are desperate to care less. It was people are exhausted from caring in ways that drain them. Covey would have understood this. His framework was never about productivity in the shallow sense. It was about maturity, ownership, and alignment. And Let Them, Let Me sits neatly in that lineage, a tool not for passivity, but for reordering where responsibility begins and ends. So we learn slowly that we do not need to follow every urge. That strength may look like staying still, that dignity may mean saying nothing. That clarity arrives not in the explanation you give, but in the one you no longer need. And in that pause, in that half second between what they did and what you might do, everything changes. Not because the world softens, but because you do. And in doing so, you become strong in the way Covey meant, governed not by the moment, but by what you want to become. To let someone be is not to forget them. It is to see them more clearly, without projection, without intervention, without turning your concern into a quiet campaign of control. But this clarity requires restraint, and restraint requires faith, not in the other person's perfection, but in their process. And perhaps more importantly, in your own ability to stay present without fixing. That is where the practice becomes real, not in dramatic moments, but in the small hesitations, the withheld corrections, the silence you choose instead of the well-crafted reply. This is where the work of Iris Murdoch gently enters. For Murdoch, love was not primarily an emotion. It was attention, the capacity to see the other as real, opaque, unknowable. Let them becomes a moral act when it is paired with this kind of seeing. It is not indifference. It is the refusal to collapse someone else into your version of their life. It is a choice to witness rather than rewrite, and in doing so, you grant them the dignity of complexity. But Murdoch's insight has a mirror. The same moral attention we offer outward must be extended inward. Let me is not indulgence, it is self-recognition. It is admitting that you too are in process, that you too are learning how not to collapse into other people's reactions, that you too are hard to love sometimes and worthy of it anyway. Robbins' language here is deceptively simple, but underneath it lives the quiet labour of emotional maturity. We often associate maturity with self-control, but this kind of control is not tight-fisted. It is not clenched. It is loose, open-handed. You are not gripping the moment. You are offering it space, and space is what makes reflection possible. Let me is not a retreat from care. It is the recovery of perspective. The reminder that your worth is not tied to your ability to absorb the chaos of others. What remains then is not less connection, but a different kind. A connection no longer managed but met. A love no longer earned but offered. A presence that doesn't need to be proven. To let someone be and to let yourself respond from a place of clarity is a profound act of generosity. Not because it is grand, but because it is rare. Because in a world of instant commentary and curated reaction, silence has become a sacred act. And to practice it even once is to remember that some of the most transformative relationships are the ones where you finally stopped trying to manage everything and simply stayed. There is a quiet bravery in not intervening, in watching someone make the same mistakes, speak the same line, pull away once again, and choosing not to step in with the usual commentary, the usual fixing, the usual fear is not resignation. It is radical permission. It allows the other person the full arc of their agency, even when that agency is messy, misguided, or slow. And let me reclaims yours, not as control, but as response, as presence, as the willingness to be changed only by what is truly yours to carry. This becomes clearest in moments of intimacy, in the slow weather of long relationships, romantic, familial, platonic, where proximity can easily become surveillance. The more we love, the more tempted we are to manage. But management is not care. Management is anxiety dressed in usefulness, and what people long for beneath the noise is to be trusted, not tracked, seen, not steered. Let them interrupts the instinct to monitor. Let me restores the possibility of real closeness by removing the terms. Bell hooks reminds us that love and domination cannot coexist. So many of our interactions are shaped by the language of persuasion, even with those we love most. But love is not leverage, and let them is not a withholding of affection. It is a refusal to turn affection into coercion. It is a boundary around the sacred. You do not need to be the emotional janitor of every room you walk into. You do not need to tidy the lives of others in order to feel useful. And in the moments when you do, when your silence breaks, when your restraint falters, when you reach for old patterns, let me becomes the way back. Let me apologize without self-erasure. Let me notice my fear without making it someone else's fault. Let me repair what I can without trying to be flawless. Robin's phrasing is disarming because it offers no promise of mastery, only a practice, a habit of release, a rhythm of return. This rhythm is deeply relational. It creates a kind of music between people, not the kind where everyone plays the same note, but the kind where each person is allowed their own timing, their own key. And in that music, real connection forms, not because one person was strong enough to hold everything together, but because both people were finally allowed to be whole, even if only briefly. That is the gift. That is the work. Let them. Let me. Let us try again. To trace this further back is not to expose imitation, but to honour resonance. Ideas do not arrive fully formed. They echo, they refract, they pass from one mouth to another, altered by time, softened by use. Robin's Let Them, Let Me is not a break from philosophy. It is a continuation. She gives us a phrase that lives easily in the mouth, but behind that ease is a long structure. Frankl's defiant inner space, Murdoch's moral attention, Roger's open regard, Covey's deliberateness, Laozi's soft power. These aren't citations, they are sediment, layers of thought beneath the modern voice. What Robbins offers is not just a method, it is a kind of clarity, a reorientation of effort from the outer world to the inner compass. It challenges the myth that love means adjusting the world around us, that responsibility means carrying others until they walk as we want them to. Instead, it opens a different path to hold less, but more wisely. To act with care, but not as compensation for someone else's unwillingness. To remain intact without hardening. In this light, let them becomes a form of courage. Not the hero's leap, but the stillness that refuses to intervene. Let me becomes a form of loyalty, not to others, but to one's own groundedness. To live this way is to accept complexity, to resist the constant pull to fix what is not yours, to trust that some of the most powerful transformations happen away from our view. This is not easy. It is not neat. Sometimes it means watching someone you love falter. Sometimes it means feeling the ache of not being asked to help. But it also means coming home to yourself, not as retreat, but as reconnection. Because that's where the listening begins. That's where dignity returns. Not just for them, but for you. And so we trace back, not to diminish a phrase, but to show the ground it stands on. We trace back to recognize that in a world flooded with advice, some wisdom arrives not with authority, but with simplicity. And when it does, we might do well to follow it, not because it is new, but because it carries the weight of what we've always known, that freedom begins the moment we stop performing control and begin to live it. Let them. Let me. Let this be enough. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.